Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Battle. I'm a shareholder with Elliott Davis. Spend most of my time focused on the manufacturing and distribution industry. Today, we continue our multi-part series titled An Operational Discussion. The series, as you've been watching it, has been focusing on topics such as IT strategy, cost reduction, supply chain management, managing an M&A process, amongst a bunch of other topics as well. We hope you've enjoyed these topics, and especially as you've been navigating the COVID-19 environment, we hope these topics have been very meaningful to you and to your business. Today we have our 12th and our final installment of our series, and it's titled Risk Management. So today we have with us Tom Uva. Tom Uva is a director in our management consulting practice. Tom, you've been a regular face on these videos. Do you want to take a minute and just introduce yourself for the people who have not watched?
Yeah, I'm feeling right at home. Appreciate everybody watching. As Richard said, my name's Tom Uva with our management consulting services practice. And really, a lot of what our practice focuses on is operational improvements, efficiencies. A lot of the topics that you've seen here in the series is really where our practice concentrates. Most of us have very significant industry experience. So what we try to bring to the program is that combination of very simple, practical, result-oriented advice. You'll hear me use that term quite a bit from those of us that have kind of been in those chairs. You know, we understand the challenges that are faced in industry, and also the ability to take practices that we see across different companies and be able to bring them here and share those with you.
Well, good. Well, Tom, thanks for being with us again today. We look forward to the conversation about risk management. So let's jump in here. In summary, before we get started too much, just want to make sure we know what we're trying to accomplish for the audience today. So we're going to try to cover maybe four different topic areas around risk management for you. First is just there's been shifts over the last 10 to 15 years. So what have those shifts in risk management been? Maybe a little bit of a level setting, just what are the basic elements of risk that we're going to talk about. Third, how do the principles of risk management practically apply to the topics in our previous 11 series that we've had. And then finally, a concept of active management. So where and how do you start when we're dealing with risk management? All right, so jumping in here, Tom, I've heard you say this before. And I think I agree with it. In my years of dealing with manufacturing and distribution companies, and I think risk management is a topic that's always there. It seems to always permeate under the surface. It's something that I think most people think is very important, right? It's a very important topic. I'm not sure that everybody sees it as a critical topic. And I've heard you say this before, right? That critical always trumps important. And watching this, navigating it over the last 20 so plus years of my career, I've seen that. I've seen some people take it as very critical and deal with it. Some is very important. You've done this for a long time. You've dealt with risk management for a long time. Can you talk to us just a little bit about, say, over the last 10 to 15 years, let's say, you've dealt with different companies, different sizes, different degrees of professional maturity. What are some of the shifts and the changes that you've seen in risk management over that period?
Yeah, no, Richard, this is a great topic. And as we were preparing for today, this is one thing that we wanted to try to work into the conversation a little bit, because we think it's important to kind of understand, where risk management has come from and kind of what it's evolved to over time, and what we see with the companies that do it well and the ones that don't do it so well. It's kind of like being on Dean's list and Dean's other list. But some of the top things that we see is, if you look back over time, this notion of risk management kind of had this stigma where it was this big, heavy, overweighted, red tape ridden function, and it kind of got a scarlet letter, unless you were building missile systems and space shuttles and nuclear power plants and all those types of things where you really need good, strong, highly disciplined risk management. But what we've really seen the effective folks do is kind of pare that down and focus on the basics, the very basic elements, right? So there's all sorts of tools. You can go out and spend $30,000, $40,000 on a risk management tool. Don't need to do it. There's very complicated models. Really don't need those either. But what we see is for the folks that understand those basic things, and we're going to talk about those very shortly here, and just do them well and actively manage those, which we'll talk about a little bit as well, and figure out ways to make them part of the culture of the weekly operations within the company, the leadership meetings, the executive team meetings, and all the way down the line. How do we take those concepts, boil them down to simple things, and actively manage them? And I used the term before, simple, practical, and result oriented. I think if, again, when I look at folks that do this well, those are common themes that I see when they go through and try to implement risk management in a little bit more of a disciplined way, but they don't go over the top. The days of the 50 and 60-page risk management plans, by and large, are long gone, right? People don't have time to read them, they don't have time to write them, and they don't have time to manage them. So being able to take those concepts, distill them down, embed them in the operations on a weekly basis, plus or minus, those are some of the major shifts that we've kind of seen over time. And as you said, important but not critical, or important not urgent. That's the other thing, where this is one of those topics where it's very easy to kind of let it slide to the back burner. Having that company discipline and the cultural discipline to not let that happen is another thing we see that kind of separates those at the front of the pack from those at the end of the pack.
So it's interesting. You talk about the basics, right? And I think it's difficult. I see it, right? It's difficult for companies sometimes to really simplify their approach to anything. And risk management is a massive topic, right? There's so many things that fall underneath risk management. But let's talk a little bit more about kind of going back to the basics and focusing on the basics. I mean, what are some of the elements and attributes you see in companies that do this successfully? I mean, what are some of the attributes they exhibit when they're exhibiting good risk management?
No, and again, this is something that we spend a lot of time on, and we see a lot of different ways in which companies kind of go through and execute this stuff. And again, there's a ton of models out there. So what we want to suggest for consideration for everybody that's kind of watching the webinar here is, here's the kind of if you're going to focus on a small number of simple things that can have a high degree of impact and value, kind of here they are, right? So the first one really is making sure that we understand and identify what the risk is, right? We can't manage something if we don't know it even exists. And it sounds fundamental, but you'd be surprised how many times folks will go through the process of trying to just identify risk. And we'll often define that as a risk is anything that can threaten the success of X, right? So X could be a project, X could be the supply chain, X could be customer or employee engagement, right? Whatever X is, but it's anything that threatens the success of that. So just identifying it and knowing what it is as simple as it is really step number one. The second thing to think about is, what are the chances of this risk occurring? Simple, hey, on a scale of 0 to 100, what's the percent that it could happen, right? And again, the intent is, we don't need 5 degrees of precision. We just need to have good relative, kind of separation. We want just a ballpark of what we think, the odds of this risk occurring are. The second thing is, okay, if the risk does occur, what's its impact? And again, it could be a simple scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 10. Keep it simple, keep it easy, and we want to understand what that business impact might be. The other thing to think about is magnitude. And there's really kind of a couple things around that one. One is around the timing, right? So when we think about impact, there's the magnitude of the impact, and then there's the timing of the impact. Is it near term, midterm, short term? And a lot of times folks will have a tendency to think about this in 0 to 30 days, maybe 30 to 90, 90 out. So depending on what your frame of reference is, you kind of think in those three terms. So I mentioned probability of occurrence and impact, right? One's kind of a percentage, one is on some type of a scale. So to help you kind of sort and prioritize, if you multiply those two numbers together, then you can take a look at your inventory of risks and say, okay, what's the exposure, right? So I think about probability times the degree of impact that it may have. I multiply those together. Now I have a common denominator in which to kind of look through my list and say, okay, if I want to sort these things by the things that are most impactful and have the highest probability of occurring, I probably want to focus my time there versus others that are lower on the list, right? Because we only have so many hours in a day. So that's kind of what the exposure thing is for. And then there's two other kind of key dimensions. So one is mitigation. And usually what we'll advise people on with regards to mitigation is the objective of mitigation is how do I decrease that exposure, whether it's reducing the probability of it occurring or reducing the impact if it does occur, or hopefully both, right? I want to drive that exposure number down. But mitigation is all about taking steps before the risk manifests itself to be able to drive that exposure number down, which can be very actively managed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next thing is contingency. So that's the, hey, if my mitigation efforts fail, we want to think in advance about what our responses would be, right? So we don't want to be making an audible on the line and thinking about a risk for the first time after all our mitigation efforts fail. So we want to think about those, kind of in advance. So, if you take a look at the elements that we just described, there's another 50 that we could all probably rattle off together, but we would suggest that those are really the fundamental basics. When we talk about the basics and doing them well, if you can just focus on these simple things, the small number of things here, and figure out how to actively manage them, which we'll get into a little bit, you can serve yourself really well, right? It doesn't need to be overcomplicated by any means.
Yeah, I think it resonates very well for me. I've actually had, it's interesting, over the last 4 months, we're living in COVID world, and over the last 4 months, been in a lot of conversations because risk has been obviously prevalent through every company. There's just so many aspects of the business that is dealing with risk management right now. And I've seen some shift in some people who are doing it well of exactly what you're talking about, right? It's just not trying to overcomplicate it and get back to the basics. I was talking to one client last week, and it was centered around supply chain, right? I mean, they were so heavily dependent upon the Asia markets pre-COVID for their supply chain, and they had not done the basics, right? They had not done the basics of kind of analyzing what the risk level was if a global pandemic happens, which who would have thought that, 4, 5, 6 months ago, but it did. Right. And now they've changed their behaviors and they've integrated the basic concepts into their weekly executive discussions around risk and mitigation efforts, and probably not to the level you're talking about, but just basic conversations, which I think is very, very important.
Yeah. And Richard, again, even if it doesn't need to be perfect, but if it just needs to be good enough. Right. Because if everyone spends that energy trying to get to 100% perfection, right, we never get there. Right. But I think that's another, you bring up a really, really good point about this, is as companies are thinking through how to incorporate this into their cultures and into the way that they operate, do what makes sense and do what fits the organization. And just because it's on some checklist doesn't mean that you have to do it. If it doesn't add value, kill it. And if it does, like in the example that you gave, it sounds like they figured out a way to take these concepts and incorporate them into the operations and the culture in a way that makes sense for them, gives value, but yet doesn't force them to spend a lot of useless cycles managing things that really don't matter.
That's right. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's build on that. Let's talk about, we've been through, like I mentioned, this is the 12th video series in our video series. So we've had 11 previous. We've talked about a lot of different topics, right? A lot of things that touch different aspects of business. Can you maybe spend a little bit of time just talking to us about those prior topics and the link between risk management and all those topics? I think it touches all of them, right?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, in the spirit of full disclosure, I would love to be able to sit here and say, hey, we saved risk management for the end because we knew that it just had this ubiquitous tie across all these topics, and it kind of worked out that way in the structure. But the reality is that that's really the truth. If we go back through the series and you're able to go through and if you've seen any of them or go back and decide to take a look at them, there's this thread of risk management that runs through all of them, right? So one of our topics was around supply chain, just like you mentioned with your customer. And really what they were doing in that scenario, hey, we've got either product pieces, parts, materials coming from overseas. So those conversations, Richard, that you referenced, are all around mitigating those operational risks, right? And they covered that in that supply chain segment, not just about the suppliers that you immediately deal with, but perhaps maybe going upstream, one more level, things of that nature. So supply chain in that session, they spent a lot of time covering things related to risk management. Managing projects. When we went through there, risk management is a huge portion of any project, which again is kind of different than day-to-day operations. And good project managers really embed risk management into how they run their projects. So you'll see that theme running in there. Cost reduction, when we went through that webinar, a lot of that was around not just improving operations, but we're mitigating risk around cash flow, expenses. So really all the different topics, even with strategic planning, right? So it's okay, well, how do you put risk management in strategy, right? We haven't gotten there yet. Well, good strategic planning mitigates the risk of making the wrong investments or making poor decisions or not maximizing capital the way that we could. So there really is an element of risk management in all of those different topics that we had gone through. So interesting to think about it that way. And again, we can't cover the world in 20 minutes. And, we'd love to be able to have the conversation offline, and our contact information is available at the end to be able to follow up. But risk really is a common theme through all the different disciplines that we've covered so far in the series.
Good. All right. Well, let's we're getting into the back half of our conversation here. Let's get to a little bit more practical discussion. So you mentioned earlier around active management, right? And I'm very interested in that topic of just kind of the active management of how do you, what are practical examples of how do companies implement some of these concepts? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Absolutely. And this is, for me, this is kind of the golden nugget here is, again, when we look at companies that do this well, there's a few things I think that if you want to have some specific takeaways and say, how do I try this in my company? Here's a few things to think about. So first and foremost, whether they're projects, whether they're daily operations, whether they're executive team meetings, is have time on the agenda. And it might only be 10 minutes, but have dedicated time on the agenda and focus on what those top X risks are, right? And again, X could be 5, it could be 10, it's not 50. But if you take a look at the elements that we covered before and think about, okay, what are the things that threaten the success of the business, and have time to make sure that the management team or the project team is actively going through those, and it doesn't end at the discussion, right? If you do that, you pass, but you don't get an A, right? The real trick is it's the classic who, what, and by when, right? So if there is a risk out there, if it's going to be actively managed, I think we've all heard the phrase of if everybody owns it, nobody owns it. So it's really key. And again, this is simple stuff, but for some reason, a lot of folks don't like to do it. For each of those risks, who owns the risk? Who owns the active management or the mitigation of it? What things need to be done to reduce the probability of that risk happening or the impact of that risk, right? That was the exposure. In the next 7 days, what steps are going to be taken to impact that risk, right? So, and you get into this cadence where, hey, if the same risk is showing up each week and it hasn't moved on the chart, then we're probably not actively managing, right? So what do we need to be doing different? So it kind of forces in a healthy way that accountability around actively managing that risk. And again, keeping it simple is another one. Don't get overly complicated, with this. I mentioned the who, the what, and the by when. We actually have a good example. Again, we don't have time to go through it here. But again, if you hit us up offline, we've got some examples of some really good, simple tools. They're actually free that you can go out and use to be able to help yourself through this process. And the last thing is just trying to have something to visualize the risks. Right? Some type of hey, here's the things with an exposure of 4 or higher, or here's the things that haven't moved in the last 4 weeks. Whatever those right categories are for your business, make sure that we keep them visible and we've got the accountability to manage them. So those are really, some of the highlights around being able to actively manage those things and things you can take away and go and try out, with your teams.
Well, good. And something that always comes to mind for me is, we started this off saying, right, some people think it's important, some people think it's critical, but I think at the end of the day, every company needs to do something around actively managing their risk profile, right? And I think there's also a decision in there, right, of is it something that can be done with the team you currently have? Do you need to pull in outside resources? There's a discussion around that too, of just, don't overcomplicate it, but try to have some process in place, take it back to the basic, actively management. And if you need assistance, there are individuals like yourself that can step in and provide assistance when needed.
Absolutely. And it doesn't need to be a lot. So depending on where you are, maybe you need a little bit of help, maybe you need a lot of help, or somewhere in the middle. But it's definitely not a sign of weakness. The folks that sit back and say, yep, I got this, and then 6 months later, no progress. Another 6 months later, no progress. Definitely not a sign of weakness. And sometimes just a little bit of extra assistance, kind of like a trim tab on a boat, starts getting that big rudder going the right way, and then you're off and running on your own. So as you mentioned, Richard, our contact information is here. We're happy to help out in any capacity that might be helpful and help people accelerate up that curve.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, look, Tom, I know we had limited time today. Very, very valuable information that you provided here. Hopefully, for those of you watching, this gives you a little bit of insight into the huge topic of risk management, and gives you something to maybe take away and think about. And if as Tom said, if there's something you need assistance with, we're here to help. Reach out. We're happy to talk you through any of these concepts. Really, any of the 12 concepts that we've had in our video series. Again, we hope you've enjoyed those and look forward to talking to you more about those. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. We'll say thank you. Be on the lookout. Our management consulting practice, which Tom leads, we're going to be producing more content. If there's things you want to hear differently, let us know. But we really, really hope that you enjoyed this series and look forward to talking to you very, very soon. Thanks, Tom.
Welcome.